All right, let me introduce the next panel, which is clinical trial opportunities in India. And while these panels are like my children, I can't love one of them more than the others. This one is really special to me in many ways because it's a theme that we've focused on extensively here at USAIC. For now almost 2 decades, we've, in a subtle way, brought India into our mix. We are the USA-India Chamber of Commerce, but our focus is on innovation for patients, which means innovation for India. It's not the other way around. And we've really been focusing in ways that have gone slightly under the radar on how to elevate the ecosystem in India. So I don't want to take credit, and I want to give Koenen full credit for the transformation that we're seeing in India, but this organization has played a very substantive role in the changes, and that's what you'll hear about in this panel. I'll introduce the moderator, and then the moderator, Peter Ronco, can introduce the panelists. Peter is the Chief Executive Officer of the CRO, Emmes. He was previously at the Global Head of Development at Janssen J&J, leading a global workforce of over 9,000 employees. Peter, that's twice the number of employees we have at Takeda in R&D, across 40+ countries, responsible for the operational execution of all phase 1 through 4 studies and medical affair programs. Prior to Janssen, Peter spent 14 years at BMS, where he held positions of increasing leadership, including SVP of clinical operations. He is a graduate of Nottingham University in the UK. Peter, there you go. Sure.
All right, thank you. If I can get my panel to come and stand up while they're coming. My last name, Ronco. Anyone remember the Ronco adverts of the 70s and 80s? The really cheesy pocket fisherman and various different things. Sadly, I'm not part of the Ronco legacy. I'm not getting. But what I'm going to try and avoid doing is a 45-minute cheesy infomercial for running trials in India. Because that doesn't benefit anyone. What I think will benefit us is actually having honest dialogue around where things are working, where things are not working. And that's why I have a fantastic panel that I'm joined with today. And what we have is a couple of different perspectives. We have the perspective from the sponsor side. We have a couple of leaders who head up development organizations. We have Sarah from Takeda, we have Christoph from Bayer, that are in various stages of thinking about running trials in India. We also have Badhri, who has done it in Novartis and is now continuing to work in Unilabs, but also has a great experience of how to run and build out programs in India. And then finally, we have folks who look across the industry and see it both the small biotech, SMID, as well as the larger. We have Peyton from Parexel, and we have Dinkar, who's joining us from PwC. So I really do appreciate all your perspectives. And for those of you, look in your packets. There is this document, which is the most recent PwC report on clinical trials in India. And for those who are too busy or lazy to read it, Dinkar, could you give us a quick overview of a couple of the key takeaways and what's changed in the last 12 to 18 months that would be kind of newsworthy?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Maybe I can just, I'll just summarize a few points from that study and then certainly, for all the panel members to comment on it. I'm neither the industry nor a sponsor nor a CRO, so clearly probably the least value to add here as a consultant, but at least we talk to a lot of people, a number of folks like yourself. A few things. I think if we just agree that the whole clinical trial space is ripe for innovation, Chris said that in the morning, and 2, India's participation in it is quite insignificant right now, or has been. So if we just all agree on that as facts, what the study really says is that India has come a long way, if we say in the last 5 to 7 years, but still has a long way to go. I think that's probably the best way to characterize it. Maybe I'll just highlight a few things, some both positive, but also things to keep in mind. Developments in the last, I know you said, Peter, last 18 to 24 months, if I can just go say last 5 to 6 years. It starts with the regulation. And I think there was a concerted effort in 2019 with the new drug and clinical trial rules to really change the regulation. There are things in there, if you read the rules about more streamlined process, reduced timelines for approval, ethical committees. And truly, we've seen some improvement, the 90-day rule. But on the flip of that is it's inconsistent. And if you don't get those rules, then India is a maze in regulation, as many of you know. So that's one part. I think we can all agree that there's a real step change in medical infrastructure in India in the last 5 to 7 years. The world-class hospitals, the networks. The study, you will see stats there, 2.5 times increase in trained investigators now. But the flip of that is it's really in tier 1 cities. There used to be a view that let's go to tier 2 and tier 3 cities for patients. There's a huge drop in quality of infrastructure after you go from tier 1 cities. The third thing we found is really this public-private partnership or research. There was a view, and rightly so, that hospital networks and is really in health networks are there for profit and for commercial use. But really, I think there's a move towards research partnerships. If you take the Medanta-Duke partnership, if you take the ICMR network, but again, it's really just scratching the surface. So maybe I'll just quickly just wind here, Peter, for the panel members. The 4 things what we found or the study recommends is, number 1, go into India very thoughtfully and very deliberately. Think of the therapeutic areas. For example, pick high burden disease areas, pick the kind of trials you're going to go for. Number 2, go to tier 1 cities. That's where the infrastructure is there. That's where the hospital beds are there. That's where the trained investigators are there. So really focus on tier 1 cities. Number 3, pick some niche areas. There are some regulations like orphan drugs, or if there's already an approved drug outside in the US, Europe, there are some waivers and fast track. Try to take advantage. And fourth and final that we found is really it's building a network of partnerships, whether it's with the Apollos or Medantas, or what Tata has done, Pfizer has done with Tata in oncology. So really think, or the ICMR partnerships, really think about how you can work with trusted partners. So that's what the study really talks about, and would love to hear from the panel members, what they feel.
Fantastic. And maybe that's a great place to start. So Badhri and then Christoph, give us your thoughts on those 4 areas, or how does that marry up with your experience? What works, what doesn't work as you're building out inclusion of India in development programs?
So I'll pick on a theme that we just heard, which is go to India deliberately. I think India is one of those countries where if you don't do the basics right, you will be penalized for it. And you will be penalized in terms of patient recruitment, in terms of quality, et cetera. So a few things that I would say is, 1, stop comparing India to China. They're 2 different elements, and they're 2 different animals. So you can't get in India what you may think you're going to get in China and then replicate that in India. So first is to stop that fallacy. That's 1. Second is do your feasibility, do your patient pathway well. If you don't understand your disease, and if you don't understand the patient progression in that disease and exactly the standard of care and et cetera, you will find surprises in India. So I would not go into something which is less understood. I would go into India with something that is well understood. That's second. The third is I would make sure you have the infrastructure, either your own or a CRO's. That infrastructure and maturity of that infrastructure is critical, because you don't have that. To say it provocatively, if you take a dilettante view to it, then it doesn't work. You have to actually have the maturity there. If you do that, the last thing I think is perhaps the most critical, which is I've never succeeded in going to India if I've not had good buy-in from the appropriate stakeholder, whether it's a franchise head or the development head, or whatever. You have to have that buy-in, and you have to do it in partnership. This can't be just leave it with me and I'm going to go there. This has to be done in partnership. That's what I would add to what you just said.
Right. Christoph?
Let me build a little bit on this comment about go into India deliberately, because I think that's super important here. I agree with Badhri, and I don't always agree with him. India is not China. And if I'm trying to replace China, which might be tempting actually, with India, I'm going to fail. Yeah, and I've actually done a little bit in preparation for this, a little bit of reflection of how we in Bayer have fared over the last 5 years in India. And then a couple of things that are positive. Yeah, they're especially an organization that has Nexavar PTSD, we've made progress in India. We are now not saying categorically no We say, let's see. Yeah? And we did, by accident, actually, an interesting experiment where we actually took the same drug in 2 indications and conducted both studies in India. One in HFpEF, the one in CKD. One where the epidemiology is okay, equivalent to the overall global epidemiology, and another indication, CKD, where you're basically at almost 200% of the global epidemiology. And the result was, even so we kind of attributed in our feasibility to the epidemiology, yeah, we overperformed in CKD more than twice as much as anticipated, whereas we underperformed 50% in the HFpEF area. And that for me is actually a very important point because, the way I approach India right now is we go into India where it absolutely makes sense. Yeah? And the epidemiology is an extremely important part here. And I think that, and I'm pretty sure there's a lot of experience around the industry in the same way, is probably the most important measure right now for me to say, okay, we go into India or not.
Great, thank you. Now, both of you have talked about the importance of getting stakeholders bought in and making sure that there's actually support within the broader organization. Sarah, as someone who's kind of on that journey as well, can you talk a little bit about how you have approached kind of improving or changing the mindset of your company to say this is something that makes sense in the right situation for the right program?
Yeah, and it's certainly a journey, and we're not the front runners here, right? So we benefit from people like Badhri and Christoph who've been there before and very generously, also through Karun's network, shared their learnings and experiences and have definitely helped us see a path towards the clinic in India here. Now, the importance of bringing your internal stakeholders along can't be overemphasized. I have to reflect a little bit on the previous panel where you all seem to think that Andy holds very generous purse strings. My experience with him is more of that of a supplicant. So when I go and ask for clinical trial funding, what I get to hear is, can you do it faster and cheaper? So why do you go to any country to run clinical trials? It's to find the patients with the right indication and then to run your studies as quickly as possible and as cost efficiently as possible, right? And that's where India plays in as one of those new countries or geographies that we can go to. Now, bringing the organization along, we've had so many discussions that have probably ring true from your previous journeys, and they include things like, well, what about the intent to commercialize in that country? And we've heard here before that the business opportunities in India maybe are lagging sort of 10 years into the future, and the business opportunities will grow. So the intent to commercialize right now might not quite be there, but it will be there in the future. Other questions that came up are, what about the quality? What about the risk of, let's say, TB in an immunocompromised population? You have to think through all of that, right? So what we've decided to do is to be very deliberate about the choice of indication and really follow the epidemiology. You brought up chronic kidney disease. That's one of the areas that we'll be starting a late-stage trial in this year. And we've gone out and visited sites just over the last few months. And, you know, the Medantas and Apollo systems of this world really stand out as fantastic trial sites with proven track records. Now, that's not to say that as we build our confidence in a few select indications and with a limited number of trials to start out with, we're going to have to show that the quality holds up. And so we have to do frequent site audits and follow the data, as it were. But then as we build confidence, I actually see many of our trials for the appropriate indications going to countries like India in the future.
Great, thank you. So we've heard from now 3 large biopharma companies. Peyton, you see it across the entire industry, from small biotechs all the way through. What additional trends, how would you add to this in terms of what you've seen recently?
Yep. Thanks, Peter, and great to be on this panel again. And last year I committed on this panel I'd bring back my data and see how we've done in this area. So I would say all of the panelists, definitely the trends that we see. Most of our studies historically have been large pharma, but we are beginning to see that change. I know that was one of the specific data points that we had questions about. Last year we're seeing actually a number of biotech companies, but I think the intention comment is spot on. You really have to, looking at the feasibility analysis, really make sure it's the appropriate protocol. Our data tends to be later stage. The TAs that we're seeing the biggest numbers in are oncology, no surprise, rare, so that's interesting, cardiometabolic, and we also have a vaccine study actually rolling. So I would say when I looked at the data, though, I was disappointed that the progress wasn't as far as I thought. So exactly spot on with the PwC analysis. High double-digit gains percentage-wise, anemic in terms of the numbers, because it's off of such a small number. And at leaving last year's presentation, I also took it back to our industry association and said, hey, can we pull together our data in a way? And they've done that. That's now publicly available on ACRO, the Association for Clinical Research Organizations website as well. And that also gave me a bit of a pause, to be honest with you, because when we looked at the data for 2024, it was 238 studies across the 5 largest CROs. That's not a lot, right? And when I looked at that, I felt actually under-penetrated. My share of that is 15%, 18%. So that's not where it should be, if you other things being normal. So what's holding us back, right? And I tried to tease out that data a little bit further. What is it that's holding us back? It tends to be some of the same feedback, I think in terms of concern, about quality. Clearly we're missing a lot of the biotech. I am encouraged by, I've got right now 5 biotech customers that are assessing adding India, partly related to rescue type opportunities. And we also have 1 biotech that I'm happy to be close to in a respiratory indication where I will tell you the top performing country is India. And so I think that data, right, and being able to share that kind of data in an anonymized way is really, really important, because then we know where it works. And I think the last point I would make is partnerships, are really critical. So we have invested in the past year there. I've been there personally, also at sites. We've added to our site alliance network. So those are our top tier sites where the contracting's done, everything's easy, and that's critical for us. And it tends to be in your tier 1 cities. Like you mentioned, we've got 2 academic medical centers, and we also have the Medanta that's been, Medanta has been mentioned, but we're also now looking at several oncology site networks as well. So again, being there at the sites, building those relationships, I think is critical for us. And the only other thing I would share, which is probably relevant to almost everyone in the room, is if you have employees in India, this is incredibly important to them. I have 6,000 employees in India. And when I am there for town halls, they want to see that I'm doing exactly what this panel is doing, educating people on the opportunity to address an underserved market where clinical trials are underrepresented, yet so much of the important work that's happening to actually move drugs forward, is there. And for the CROs of those five companies, we have 47,000 employees in India. So it's truly an opportunity. We've got the talent. We're certainly growing the talent on the clinical side, but it did speak, unfortunately, it just pinpoints it underscores a lot of your data, that there's a lot of opportunity remaining.
Can I say a word about quality?
Please do.
Because when we started internally the discussion, should we put more effort into India? The quality thing was always this big elephant in the room. And again, I've really done an effort and looked back. Yeah. And this is now data on phase 3 studies, but it's 5 phase 3 studies we've conducted in India over the last couple of years. And the quality is just the same as we see on average in the rest of the world. Yeah, so as much as I'm pretty sure all of us have bad experience in India, I sometimes think it's a little bit of a myth that still stops us to do more in India.
No, so I think that's a really good point, because for an industry that is so data-driven, we hang on every p-value and we look at it, and try and interrogate it. We then operate other decisions based on myths and stories from last century. And some of them are valid, but some are not. So for other panel members, what other myths do you think are true representations of operational and logistical issues in India versus others that really should just be pushed onto the back burner and said, that's been solved. Peyton, do you want to kick
Yeah,
off?
sure. The sponsor concerns that we hear are exactly one, historical data concerns. So it's interesting when someone frames it as historical, right? Then they know they're not sure if that's really true. The regulatory uncertainty is a big one. Any transparency that we could get on the regulatory side, particularly turnaround times, we are seeing some inconsistencies in terms of those timetables, would be very, very helpful. On my last trip to India in February, I did meet with some of the executive committee members of ISCR, the India Society for Clinical Research, and I think they are really trying to work on this. They're aware, actually, of this meeting as well, which is great. So, they've heard about you, which is fantastic, because I think when we get that kind of momentum, could they share some of their data, really working with DCGI, being able to really bring some of that forward, because that's a challenge, right? That's a headwind. But those are the three big ones that we heard.
Great. Badhri?
Yeah, so when we started going there, we repeatedly heard three myths. One, which Christoph has already talked about, and Peyton has embellished, which was a quality myth. And actually what we found was there was much greater adherence to ICH and GCP and stuff like that, because these are people who really are working under that shadow saying, yeah, your quality is not good. So they want to definitely prove themselves to be others. So anyway, that was one myth. The second was infrastructure is really poor to conduct clinical trials in India. And while that may be true in very small cities, it is definitely not true in tier 1 cities. It's world-class infrastructure. It is as much on point as it is in any other country or any other, at least Western country in the world. And the third one was the competence of investigators. Perhaps they are not competent to be participating in clinical trials. Perhaps that is an area where they're not adequately trained, etc. And again, we didn't find that. We found highly competent investigators. In fact, just the raw number of patients that they see makes them competent even beyond a typical, perhaps, doctor in any other country who would see a far less volume of some of these highly prevalent or highly incident diseases. So all three of these myths were exactly that. They were myths. But it has been built up, and you just can't take this for granted. So I think this is where the active buy-in comes in. You can't just assume, this is just a myth that I'm just going to go forward. You have to actually work to address them and dispel them. And if you don't, then the myths take over.
So we learned earlier on that China and India are different countries and should be thought of differently. But what can India learn from China? This is open to anyone on the panel here, because what I think we've seen over the last couple of years is a significant increase in the volume of research, both from China biotechs, but also China biotechs moving outside of China to do research more globally, as well as the ongoing explosion of the work in China. So what can taking your point that quality is really not an issue, that in the tier 1 cities, the infrastructure is not an issue, what can India regulators and other government, academia learn from the China story to say, how can we try and not replicate it because it's different countries, but learn from it and build on it? Peyton, do you want to start?
I think number one is definitely the regulatory side. That's the page that they can take from China and even from MHRA in terms of bringing transparency to that data and making that publicly available. That's a huge asset to be able to have. But I think China's regulatory change is probably the number one thing that India can do.
And when you say you're talking about predictability.
Predictability. Yep.
Yeah, because there was a comment, we had a breakfast meeting this morning where we were talking about this, and the comment was it was the difference between say and do. Mm-hmm. And when you have say and do are the same, you can work, you can operate. When say and do are different, which again is the reality in many cases, that becomes an issue for planning. Is that?
It's exactly right. And even the sponsors in country in India from some of the large pharma companies, they did not feel comfortable sharing their data yet because they felt like it might actually be in conflict, with regulators. So we need to make sure that we can just open up and make this all transparent, right? Because then we'll be able to track year-over-year improvement.
Can I add one point there, because I think our patent lawyers would hate it if I don't mention this. And I don't want to go too much into this because I think everyone knows it, but of course the patent situation, data exclusivity, is something that is specific to India and creates a high degree of uncertainty that we just don't have in China. And that is something that needs to be fixed.
Dinkar?
Yeah, maybe just one other point as a learning, and from China is that I think government involvement, and I'll keep it to that word because it's may mean different in China than in India, but the government support, investment, involvement, I think is the one thing to learn is that now in China it could have been a little more, they can do it with a stronger hand. But I think those government incentives, what they've invested in research over the years and taking the long-term view, probably is something I think India can really learn from. Now, it may come in different forms, but I think that is something, if they really want to transcend, it's probably one learning.
Yeah, and just putting that into perspective too, is that what we're seeing coming out of China now is a lot of basic science innovation that is very rapidly being brought forward through the clinic, generating evidence in people, and we're seeing a lot of deals being made with Chinese companies here now that we all benefit from. So that's another huge opportunity, I think, for India, because everything we've been talking about on this panel so far has been really executing later stage clinical trials. We haven't talked about the potential of all the untapped innovation in the earlier preclinical stages, what's coming out of the universities, and you mentioned a few things in the ecosystem that could be improved upon, and the early phases of clinical research that remain really untapped.
Can I just add two things? I think one of the things that China has done really well is to look at the entire ecosystem of clinical trials, or perhaps just the whole drug development and drug innovation ecosystem, and addressed every single part of that ecosystem in a connected way. And I think what I'm finding, or what I've seen, and perhaps just a personal view in India, is you get fixes that are point solution fixes. So just because you fix the IRB problem doesn't mean everything is better, because the things up and above that and below that are yet unfixed. So it's not an ecosystem fix, it's a point solution fix. And as long as we have a point solution fix, the ecosystem doesn't change. What happens is, I think, the ecosystem finds a way to navigate around those point fixes. And I think that's one thing. And the second thing is a clarity of policy. So there's policy and there's implementation of policy. The clarity of the policy is just that the policy is issued, but perhaps not down to the detail of how it's implemented and how it's sustained. So we have policies around, new policies I think that have come in around ethics committees. Mm-hmm. That's been rolled out. But exactly what is the training that is needed, exactly how is it going to be sustained, exactly what happens when you violate that policy, the details of that are yet perhaps not clear. And absent those details, the policy then becomes very hard to follow, implement, cumbersome.
So I'm tying a couple of your comments together, because if I compare and contrast, a lot of there's more of an integrated viewpoint in China in terms of how all the different pieces fit together, and there is more of an aligned viewpoint on how some of the policies also stack up. Within India, is there also a difference between the kind of provincial, state versus local versus national level? Is that also a contributing factor, or is that not? Is that a red herring?
I haven't seen that, but I've seen differential interpretations of that depending upon the institution that you go to. So it perhaps manifests itself in how it is implemented, followed, adhered to in the institutions, that then becomes local variations.
Yeah. Perfect. So one of the conversations we had this morning at the clinical trial breakfast was that the current US regulatory healthcare landscape changes impacting many, many groups, including a lot of institutions, academic medical centers and so forth. There's a level of uncertainty that also provides some opportunity. What, if you were kind of trying to look into your crystal balls for 2, 3, 4 years from now, what do you think this uncertainty will actually help India do? And what advice would you give to folks who are looking to kind of expand that? Anyone?
I can start.
Christoph, you're quickest.
I mean, the way I see it, look at this is, India was going to evolve anyway. India has a large population, It has a healthcare system that is improving tremendously in quality. It has extremely talented, well-educated people. So the importance of India in the healthcare ecosystem, yeah, in any form, what was going to evolve anyway. I think I guess that's the crystal ball now, it might now be facilitated by the fact that it might be somewhat more difficult to drive innovation in the US. And that is the opportunity I see for India. And I think we opportunistically will jump into that and maybe do more than we had originally planned. But we had originally planned to do research in India anyway.
And I think in terms of trial recruitment, with the EU CTR process not being the most user-friendly either, right? There are opportunities to find patients elsewhere, and we heard about the amazing infrastructure and the really fantastically trained PIs, so it's a good place to go and build.
So I think the biggest difference that's happened because of perhaps the macro environment around us is the opportunity in India has gone from India pulling and asking people to come or saying, please come and do trials here, to actually a push environment where the external world is now saying, well, you are a viable option for me to go do trials or have activities there. And I think that window where you actually have an external pressure saying, do something because I want to come there, I think that's a very powerful force. And if that's capitalized, then I think the move that India can make can be, the curve can be a pretty steep curve of maturing that. Because in the past, it was just I have other options, and I'll go to India when I've exhausted all my other options.
I think, Badhri, you're spot on. I do. I think there could be an inflection point. And us all sharing what's working and what we're seeing in terms of success could be very helpful to that. I'm very encouraged, particularly by the success on some studies that are very difficult studies to recruit and enroll. And the fact that we're looking at India now is really a strong candidate for some rescue opportunities. That says a lot about the capabilities.
And that is also a fundamental change from, I think, where we were as an industry 5-10 years ago, where a lot of times the general philosophy was go to India for simpler studies, primary care studies, and there still may be an effective place, but when we're talking about much more complicated, looking at rescue studies, that I think is very highly credible. So any of the panel, what types of studies would you not recommend trying to include India in? Beyond the obvious epidemiology ones, where would you say that's probably not the right, likely, successful opportunity to prove that? That wasn't on the list, so now that's all screwed everyone up, hasn't it?
I mean, right now, I would not take an extremely complicated, highly involved study. To give you an example, we just started a late-stage development study in Parkinson's disease, cell therapy. We didn't even discuss India. Now, and I don't think it will ever be on the list at this point.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. The protocol matters, right? The details matter, not just the indication. I did look at all of our indications. I was surprised how many, oncology studies where standard of care is advanced now in India, and we really are seeing second and third line type studies there that were perhaps more sophisticated than I would have thought, actually. But it is interesting because there's more diverse therapeutic areas for our mix than I expected.
And generally speaking, we're looking more at later stage opportunities, phase 2, phase 3, to take to India rather than phase 1s that we would probably take elsewhere at this moment in time.
So there's things that I would do which have therapeutic aspects to it and things that are operational aspects. On the therapeutic side, something is complicated but well understood, I would still go to India. Something is complex and poorly understood. I am still trying to understand the nature of the disease, the pathway, the mechanism of action, whatever. That I would not go to India yet. That's on the therapeutic side. On the operational side, I would not go to India because I want to get first patient, first visit in as soon as possible. That is not an India scenario, at least in my opinion. I would go for area under the curve, and area under the curve as soon as possible. So if India is sold as let's go to India so that we can accelerate first patient, first visit, I think that may be a little hard to achieve. But let's go to India because here's where we can find more patients and fill that area under the curve. That's where I would.
And I'm going to go back to Peyton's comment, which is so much of it is protocol dependent. If I just make a sweeping statement, primary care works, but specialty doesn't, that's a dumb, naive, blunt statement. If you can actually look at the individual protocol, look at the opportunity space and say, is this going to make sense? Is this something that we can actually run through? Then you have a much greater likelihood of success. All right, we have about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to go down the line for one more last comment from each folks here. Again, you were dragged onto this panel assuming that you were supportive of growing India. If not, Koenen would have vetoed you and blacklisted you. So what one piece of advice would you give to, you can choose, either a skeptical head of operations, head of development, head of a therapeutic area to say this is how you should start dipping your toe in India, or you can choose what advice would you give to the India regulators if they were sitting right in front of you right now. Okay, you can choose either one or you can take both if you're greedy. We have 5 minutes. So Peyton, we'll start with you. We'll work this way down the line.
Oh, fine. I get to go first. So I'm going to take the easy one. I'm going to take the regulators. My advice would be to regulators to really be transparent, with their turnaround time, so we can see that consistency and really open the doors to India.
You took mine. No. Maybe on the other side, I think the two things. It truly is a viable option, but you have to go in with your eyes wide open. And you cannot do an arm's distance. I think you have to manage it carefully. But there is a lot of opportunity if you do it in the right way.
So my advice would probably go in the ClinOps direction. I think it's extremely difficult to dip in your toe only. I think, and that's actually something I guess we do everywhere. If you make a decision to go into India, you have to create an internal infrastructure that allows you to really do that. And that is a commitment. So if you go to India, you basically have to go all in, and you have to be prepared to stay and really do a viable number of clinical development projects.
Well, I don't know what your definition of all in is, but there's probably a staged approach to all in, and there's certainly vendors that we heard about that we can work through. So my advice to myself would be to do a somewhat staged approach and to anticipate not having 30% of our patients come out of India for specific trials, but to go in, try and maybe get 5 to 10% from India, make sure the quality is good, and then scale from there.
Can I clarify what I mean with all in, of course, is that, no, but I think it's an important point, yeah? But the infrastructure has to exist and needs to be viable.
So I will take a slightly different view to it, and I would say two things. One is information asymmetry. I think just because the fears exist, the minute you don't hear from a trial in India for a month, or a particular investigator for 6 weeks, or your frequency of visits is a little bit less, it starts to create internal panic or internal anguish. So avoid information asymmetry. And I think to avoid that, use the tools that are modern tools that are available. India is, I think the one thing that India, everybody can agree, is digitally extremely savvy. So use that digital infrastructure in India to avoid information asymmetry that makes everybody comfortable or over-index on information. That's what I would say.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think just to add my own color commentary, because I can answer my own question, I think starting with the right study is absolutely key. Portfolio of studies that you feel will meet the needs, both commercially, from an epidemiology standpoint, and an operational standpoint in India. And I think that the idea of Christoph's point is that can't just be one small study, because that will then become the folklore for the next 30 years in your own company. It has to be a material volume. Secondly, it is about the talent base. It's the local talent base in India, getting to know the local talent base, getting to understand how to partner with them, building out internal capabilities to make it successful, and really trying to drive that forward. So to me, those are the two key things in terms of building it. And I'm going to finish with Badhri's comment, the digital opportunity. You know, as clinical development, which in the US is still incredibly paper-based. In 2025, we are still using fax machines and we are still using paper in many of our large academic medical centers. Yes, that's embarrassing. But the more prestigious, the more paper, the more faxes. No names, no pay. We have an opportunity to actually leapfrog that from a digital standpoint. And I do think India, as well as other countries, are incredibly well positioned to really use that as a point of opportunity. So with that, I want to thank the panel for this conversation. I hope we're invited back next year to be able to talk about how that progress has been made. But thank you, and I think I'm handing back to Andy, back to Karun.